Capitulo 5, Conversation in the Brothel and Street Fight in Brocket Hall. After giving the dog to Victoria, Lord Melbourne was mad with happiness, with his heart full of hope and illusion. About an hour later he met in his library with the housekeeper and the butler of Brocket Hall, in that reality. "Mrs. Lazen, Mr. Penge," said Lord Melbourne, for in that reality the butler of Buckingham Palace, in the other reality, Mr. Penge, was Brocket Hall's butler. "I wanted to tell you both something very important. I wanted to tell you that I am very satisfied with your services. I believe without a doubt that you, Madame Lazen, are the best housekeeper in England, and you, Mr. Penge, are certainly the best butler who has been at my service." Mrs. Lazen and Mr. Penge exchanged glances of surprise, for though Lord Melbourne was very courteous and even kind to his servants, he did not usually lavish praise on them. "Thank you, my lord," said Mrs. Lazen honestly, but with her usual seriousness. "Thank you, Lord Melbourne," said Mr. Penge, somewhat more servile and with some pride. "You're welcome. Overall I am very satisfied with the services of all Brocket Hall staff, and for that reason I have decided to increase the salaries of all the employees of this house by 10%, Lord Melbourne explained to them. Mrs. Lazen and Mr. Penge were astonished, as if they had seen the Queen walking naked in central London. "But Lord Melbourne, that's..." cried Mrs. Lazen in surprise. "Is not it so extraordinary, right?" "Well, then, let it be 15%, replied Lord Melbourne enthusiastically. "Lord Melbourne, Mrs. Lazen was about to answer. What Mrs. Lazen intends to say is that all the servants of this house are deeply grateful for the great generosity of our employer. There are not enough words to thank my lord for this noble and generous act, and we are very honoured by his good appreciation of our work," Mr. Penge said in a very servile way and bowing slightly. "I'm happy to reward your excellent services. Now they can communicate the good news to all the staff," said Lord Melbourne gladly. When Mrs. Lazen and Mr. Penge went out into the hall, she uttered her thoughts aloud. "Do not you think Lord Melbourne's been acting so weird lately?" asked Mrs. Lazen. "Well, of course. And everyone knows that the reason is that he is in love with Miss Victoria," answered Mr. Penge. "That is not very convenient for either of us." "Especially for that young lady," said Mrs. Lazen in a tone of concern. "Lazen, do not get into the private life of Lord Melbourne. What happens between them is only their problem, and no one else's. And, if thanks to that infatuation, my lord is going to be even more generous, hopefully he will take her to bed soon," said Mr. Penge. "Penge!" exclaimed Mrs. Lazen scandalized. "Come on, woman. Do not be a prude, after all, love is in the air in this house," Mr. Penge said in a suggestive tone as he wrapped his arm around Mrs. Lazen's waist. "Mr. Penge!" exclaimed Mrs. Lazen, slapping his arm and leaning back to get away from him, "I thought you were clear that our agreement should remain private if you wish it to continue." "All right, my German tigress," said Mr. Penge sarcastically and mockingly. "I'm glad you're not so cold in the privacy," he said, almost whispering in her ear, then walked off down the hall. Mrs. Lazen, with a comical expression of annoyance, watched him leave, but then she could not help but sketch a small mischievous grin. The next day Lord Melbourne dressed rather elegantly and well-groomed, and prepared to go out into the street in the morning. Riding on his horse, Lord Melbourne addressed Parliament. Upon arrival, he found in one of the corridors of the parliamentary seat to the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel, who in that reality was Prime Minister at a time when in the other reality Lord Melbourne would be the Prime Minister. They exchanged a suspicious look between them. "Duke of Wellington, Sir Robert, it is a pleasure to see you gentlemen," said Lord Melbourne, greeting them with enthusiasm. "The pleasure is mine, Melbourne," replied the Duke of Wellington. "For me too, Lord Melbourne," said Prime Minister Peel, although he was not entirely sincere. "To what do we owe the unexpected honour of your presence? Does Lord Melbourne intend to reclaim the leadership of the Whig party and attempt to be Prime Minister again?" asked Robert Peel, trying to sound like a prankster, but hiding a certain uneasiness. Lord Melbourne laughed to the surprise of the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel. "Gentlemen, I have no intention of becoming Prime Minister again. I think that the country does not need me go back to govern it, there are many men who can do it, and I think that the Whig Party is in good hands. In addition, I am now very happy, and I do not wish to change that happiness for the displeasure and the dislikes of politics. I simply come to occupy my seat in the House of Lords, although I have not attended the sessions for some time. I want to participate in some sessions, because I must stop doing it for a long time, or perhaps forever," replied Lord Melbourne, laughing. "And what should that absence be, if we can know?" Lord Melbourne asked the Duke of Wellington, intrigued. "To a happy motive, I hope. But you will find out, gentlemen. Now I'm sorry, I do not want to miss the start of the session," said Lord Melbourne. Wellington and Peel watched him walk away. "You think it's sincere?" asked Robert Peel. "I cannot be sure, but I think it says the truth. I think Lord Melbourne's illusion is no longer the politics, but something else altogether. Since his son died, I had not seen Lord Melbourne so animated. My experience tells me that only a woman can cause such enthusiasm in a man." The rest of the day was very happy for Lord Melbourne, but some of that happiness dissipated when he had one of his secret conversations with Connor, and Connor asked him that them to meet at night in a very special place. Lord Melbourne arrived at a brothel, a place that was not one of the most luxurious of the city, of those favoured by the wealthiest aristocrats, but it was not one of the most grotesque or marginal. It was a brothel with a very diverse clientele, from middle-class men to wealthy men. Lord Melbourne was not used to visiting brothels since he was very young, even before he was married. In his other reality, after his marriage was wrecked, Lord Melbourne had many sexual adventures, until he met Victoria. But these relationships had not been with prostitutes, and now that he had the opportunity to be happy with Victoria, the least he wanted was to visit a brothel. His surprise was very great when he saw Connor sitting behind a table, with a young prostitute sitting on his legs and another prostitute sitting in another chair next to him, and he hugged the two girls. "Connor," Lord Melbourne said cautiously, unable to finish believing that Connor was interacting with other people. "Oh, my good friend. Sit, let me introduce you to Miss Grace," said Connor, smiling and referring to the girl sitting on his legs, while she laughed enchanted, "and Miss Fiona," he added, referring to the one who was sitting in the chair at his side, which also laughed. "It's a pleasure, ladies, Lord Melbourne, to serve you." "Mr. Connor, I'm glad to see you're having such a good time," Lord Melbourne replied with some irony. "Lord Melbourne? I do not know why that name sounds to me," said Grace, a girl who appeared to be no more than 20 years old, quite pretty, blonde and blue-eyed, with large breasts that she showed in a generous neckline. "Of course it has sound you, silly, ignorant. Lord Melbourne was the Prime Minister a few years ago, for a few months," replied Fiona, a very pretty girl, of beautiful silhouette, red-haired, and who appeared to be a little over 25 years old. "Prime Minister? I had never met a Prime Minister," Grace said happily. At that moment a third girl, white-skinned, and dark brown hair, with a beautiful body, her looked like 18 years old, and approached Lord Melbourne. "Charlotte, I'll introduce you to my friend Lord Melbourne, the one I'm telling you about," Connor said cheerfully. "It's my pleasure, Lord Melbourne. I'm yours to please whatever you need," Charlotte said in a whisper. "Magnificent. Because, like me, my friend Lord Melbourne is a cradle robber," Connor replied in a jocular and mocking tone, causing Lord Melbourne to see him with an angry look. "My dear Connor, the thief judges by his condition," Lord Melbourne answered sarcastically. "My dear Charlotte, I am very grateful for your generous offer, and believe me that I would consider it under other circumstances, but now I want to be faithful to the affection that I feel for a very special woman for me," added Lord Melbourne, speaking affectionately to Charlotte, as he gave her a quick and affectionate caress on the cheek with the back of his hand. "She's a very lucky woman, Lord Melbourne," Charlotte replied with a look of admiration and sweet sadness, while she thought about how much she would like a man like him to feel the same way for a woman like her. "I am the lucky, Miss Charlotte, and I hope someday you will make a man as lucky," Lord Melbourne said tenderly and sincerely. "In the meantime, allow me to reward all ladies with a good gratification," Lord Melbourne added, putting a few banknotes on the table, a sum greater than it would have cost the services of all together for an entire night. "And now, with the ladies' permission, I would like to have a brief private conversation with my friend Connor. Please, beautiful ladies, my friend Lord Melbourne and I need to have a talk. Miss Grace, Miss Fiona, later we continue our night of fun, we have a lot of things to do," Connor told them mischievously, and they laughed, as the girls collected the money and the three left, leaving them alone. "Did you get offended for the cradle robber? It was just a joke. I know the only little girl you intend to steal from her cradle is Victoria," said Connor, and when he saw that Lord Melbourne was again half-face of few friends, he raised his hand as if asking for quiet. "I know it's a sensitive issue for you. To make up for you, I want to tell you that I intend to help these girls get out of this life, but after they and me have a little fun." "I thought only I could see you," said Lord Melbourne. "You have a bad memory, William. I told you that the others could only see me if I wanted them to see me, and tonight they must see me," Connor replied. "And why should you have chosen precisely this place to find me?" Lord Melbourne asked reproachfully. "Patience, William, everything has its reason. Have you not heard that God writes straight with crooked lines? You just have to trust me. After all, you're doing well with Victoria, right?" Connor answered intriguingly. "I think, although I do not really know what Victoria feels about me. But I am pleased to see that she is happy," said Lord Melbourne sincerely, somewhat more relaxed. "And when do you will propose to her marry you?" Connor asked absent-mindedly, as if it were unimportant, as he ate something from a plate and drank some beer. "What? It's still too soon. I mean, I just cannot propose to her overnight, she'll think I'm crazy, Lord Melbourne said nervously at the thought and idea. "Did you ever think that you could have fought for Victoria?" Connor asked, again distractedly, and then took a sip of beer. "I do not understand what you're talking about," Lord Melbourne said confused. Connor wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and took a few moments to respond. "When Queen Victoria, when she told you of her love, at Brocket Hall, did not you think you could have fought together to defend your love and get your relationship accepted?" Connor asked, seeing Lord Melbourne with an intense look and a serious gesture on his face. "That was impossible, they would never have accepted our marriage, we would never have obtained the approval of the Privy Council and Parliament. Surely there would have been a constitutional crisis, and Victoria might have lost the throne," Lord Melbourne replied, depressed as he recalled the reasons that led him to sacrifice his happiness. "William, you better than anyone else you should know that in history and politics there is no impossible. The French Revolution, the independence of the United States, the overthrow and execution of King Charles I in the English Civil War, are events that nobody could have foreseen and even dreamed before they happened. Who guarantees you that something much smaller compared to those events as a marriage of yours to Victoria would not have finally been accepted?" said Connor. "It's not comparable, we had everything against it," Lord Melbourne said. "For you that you are a man who has never taken big risks, who has never bet strong. As Prime Minister you were not exactly a bad ruler, but you were not a particularly memorable ruler, because you preferred not to risk in major initiatives and major changes. I do not say that you did not choose the path that seemed less dangerous to your Victoria and to your country, but perhaps it was because you did not want to risk exploring or even considering other ways. Together with Victoria you could have fought to get your marriage accepted, you could combine your experience in politics, your credibility and your contacts to the courage, natural cunning and regal majesty of Victoria, and the devotion she awakens in the British people. You too could design an effective political strategy to obtain the approval of the country. You too could appeal to the public through the press, they could try to appeal to the feelings of the British people, they could conquer it for their cause. You too were able to seal alliances with important actors in politics and nobility, even of the royal family, to facilitate marriage approval. And you too could discredit the competition, which was not so difficult. Connor said passionately. That which you say may have some ground of reason, but I have lived in the bowels of the beast, the politics of this country, and I know it is not easy. But why do you torture me? That belongs to another age, to another life, to another world, replied Lord Melbourne, tormented, almost pleading. William, I warn you, you must not be wrong. I did not make you come here to give you Victoria's love on a silver tray, to make things easy for you. Learning and reflection are part of this experience, and if you want to have a happy ending you should reflect on the things I tell you. I understand that you would prefer to believe that there was no other way out so as not to harm Victoria and your country, because otherwise it would be to admit that all the suffering you experienced since Victoria chose Alberto until your death, all that unbearable pain you suffered, you could have avoided it, and that you could have been the happiest man in the world. But, as I say, another way was likely, not sure, just probable. Are you convinced that the British people would not have given you a chance? You, an English gentleman, a man who aroused no hatred in public opinion, who was seen with some sympathy by a part of the English people, and who in any case with his personal charm could conquer many hearts. On the contrary, Albert was rejected by most of the British, a dull, depressing and cold German prince, a rigid and unbearable man, a clockwork prince, as you called him yourself, continued Connor. But Victoria loved him and was happy with him, and that's what matters, Lord Melbourne said bitterly, feeling in his heart that old, very painful wounds reopened, and he could not help but feel a certain bitterness towards Victoria herself. Are you sure? You know that the relationship between them was very difficult and conflicting from the beginning, even from their courtship, and after their marriage things did not improve much, on the contrary. Did not it occur to you that Victoria wanted to believe that she was in love with Albert so as not to suffer the loneliness and pain that your rejection caused her? That perhaps, she clung to that little illusion that aroused in her the courtship of an exotic and handsome young man who seemed to worship her as if she were the only woman in the world, just when you had broken her heart, shattered her illusions and hurt her self-esteem. That later, when the coexistence made her see that beyond the moments of passion with a young timorous and inexperienced lover, but that she judged very exciting because she did not have with which to compare him. To say this, Connor saw the effect of bitterness and jealousy that this caused in Lord Melbourne, who would surely imagine Victoria in bed with Albert, that beyond that, her coexistence with Albert was a nuisance, that he was unbearable and insensitive to her true affective needs. Do not you think Victoria was unhappy in the background? But knowing to Victoria, knowing how stubborn and tenacious she is, you must imagine that she would never admit that she was wrong with Albert, because, moreover, to recognize herself, that she could never love Albert as she could have loved you, would be to accept that she would spend the rest of her life with a man she did not really love, a man who could never make her entirely happy, a man who could not understand her as you understood her. To accept her mistake would be very painful for Victoria. It was better to deceive herself and to insist on believing that her little love for Albert, more like a friendship, was that great love that every woman dreams and that she could have had with you, clear, if you would have had the courage to fight for her and for you, for both. Lord Melbourne was perplexed, as if he would have had a great revelation. But I. Lord Melbourne babbling. You never saw it like that, of course, because you were blind. Did you know that Victoria never loved her children as she should? When they were babies they seemed repulsive to her, she rejected them, she was always a cold and distant mother. Do not you think that the fact that Albert was the father had something to do? The relatively insensitive and clumsy way in which he behaved with her in her first pregnancy, combined with the discomforts and fears, created a trauma in Victoria. She never assumed motherhood with happiness, because she did not have a sensitive and good father at her side who encouraged her to be a good mother with her affection and understanding, but she had at her side that cold tin man who does not even look human. And that made that Victoria have difficult relationships with her children, especially her heir. "I'm sorry to hear that. I had no idea. I thought Victoria had a happy married and family life," said Lord Melbourne sadly. "Albert will die young, relatively young. Their marriage will last less than 22 years, and then she will become a sad and bitter widow, a queen away from her people for too many years. In the end the story will say that the balance of her reign was positive, but God only knows if it would have been much brighter without Albert in her life," added Connor. "I'm sorry, but I do not understand what good it is for to know all that, if I can do nothing to change it. Do you want me to use it as an example so as not to let the opportunity pass this time? If it is, I assure you that I understand. Soon I'm going to propose marriage to Victoria, to the other Victoria. But I only need a little more time, to be sure that I have conquered her heart," Lord Melbourne justified himself. "I'm glad to hear that, William. I just hope you do not forget this conversation," Connor said with a condescending smile. Lord Melbourne and Connor continued talking in a relaxed manner, and at that moment a man came out of a brothel room talking to another. It was Charles Elm Francatelli. "I hope all the merchandise has been to your liking," said Francatelli. "As always, Charles, the food of your uncle's business is always of very good quality, and as long as you keep selling to me at such a good price, I'll continue to provision my kitchen with you." "The old stingy man, does he still pay to you the same commission?" asked the other man, burly and who appeared to be a little over 50 years old. "You know him, he. Damn it!" exclaimed Francatelli, hiding in a corner. "What's going on?" asked the other man, alarmed by the reaction of Francatelli. "That man, over there, the one in the brown suit, who's sitting with another man in that corner, is my employer," Francatelli explained, annoyed. "Lord Melbourne? Is that man Lord Melbourne? A former Prime Minister in my business. I had never had such a distinguished client. I must go and say hello to him," said the other man excitedly, and was already preparing to walk towards him. "What are you doing, idiot? He cannot see me here," said Francatelli, taking him by the arm. "I do not know how he could react, if he know that in my spare time I am selling food for brothels, with these aristocrats never know. And besides, you must be careful, he is a very discreet man as far as I know and may want to go unnoticed, be careful when approaching him." "I see," he said, nervously. "I'm going to sneak out the back door, down the alley." "See you later," said Francatelli, and sped away, covering his face with his hat, and turning his back to the spot where Lord Melbourne and Connor were some distance away. The next day Victoria was happy, as she had been every day since she had arrived at Brocket Hall, and in her mind as usual were the images of Lord Melbourne, especially her conversations with him. In her hands she wore a bouquet of orchids, as a gift, and went to the kitchen to fetch water to place in a small vase in her bedroom, when she heard the voices of Eliza Scarrett and Charles Francatelli. Victoria was about to say hello to the couple in love, when she heard they mentioned Lord Melbourne, and then she stopped a few paces from them, who had not seen her coming, and listened, sensing that it was something she had to hear. "But was him really?" Miss Scarrett asked her fiancé. "Of course. And what's so weird about it? He is, after all, a man, even if it is the prestigious Viscount Melbourne. And besides, he is not married, and even if he were. The truth of the matter is that our dear Lord Melbourne and his friend must have had a good time last night, because it is a decent brothel and has some of the most beautiful whores in all of London," said mocking Francatelli. "Fool! What do you do by looking at the who?" Miss Scarrett said, punching him in the arm, but before she continues, she saw Victoria and was stunned. "Victoria!" Francatelli turned to see her too, and they both saw that Victoria had a bad face, as if she had received the news of the death of a beloved relative, and also they saw some tears come out of her eyes, even though she tried to keep them. "Sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you, Victoria began, but she could not finish speaking and burst into tears like a little girl, and she ran away embarrassed by her crying. "Victoria, wait! You see what you did, idiot?" Eliza Scarrett said, addressing her friend first, then her boyfriend, before rolling up her skirt and running after Victoria. "And what I did? Women, it is impossible to understand!" exclaimed Francatelli. Victoria rushed into her bedroom, closing the door, and lay down on the bed, crying disconsolately and pouting like a child. Scarrett knocked on the door and called, but when she did not get an answer, she opened the door apologizing and entered Victoria's bedroom, closing the door slowly, then sat on the bed and put her hand on Victoria's shoulder, which was still crying disconsolately. "Victoria, do not suffer, do not get like this. All men are like that, it's nothing special. That does not mean that they are bad, simply that they are men and cannot avoid it. Do you think my Charles does not want other women? I assume as normal that if the opportunity will be presented to him, he would sleep with other women, not that I like of course, but as a damned man. That's why, I would not mind that he to cheat on me, as long as I do not know, that he does it with discretion. In the case of Lord Melbourne, he is a man still young, more or less, and besides he is a widower, he does not have a woman to satisfy his needs as a man. We knew of his adventures with women, before of you arrive, but what is strange is that he visit a sight of those. I swear that it is the first time since I work in this house that I hear that he has visited a brothel," said Eliza Scarrett affectionately, comforting Victoria, stroking her head from behind. "I have no right to be like that. I'm a fool, a damn stupid!" Victoria exclaimed without ceasing to cry, pouting. "Do not say that, Victoria. Come here, my little girl," said Eliza Scarrett as she was pulling Victoria and made her lift her torso, and then Scarrett put her arms around her and put a hand behind Victoria's head to make her look into her eyes. "Do not say that again, you're not a fool or a stupid, you're just a woman in love, and that's natural." "But it's ridiculous, a nonsense!" Victoria exclaimed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why? Why are you a poor girl, a governess, and he is a rich and powerful nobleman, a former prime minister? Love is thus, Victoria, no person chooses to fall in love guided by reason or logic, but by the heart. Do you think otherwise would I have fallen in love with that idiot Charles?" Eliza Scarrett said with a mocking smile, causing that Victoria could not avoid a giggle, but then continued crying, and for that reason Eliza attracted her and made that Victoria rested her head in the chest of Eliza. "That is why a sweet poor girl can fall in love of a man who ruled this country." "But it is absurd, impossible!" Victoria exclaimed, her face buried in her friend's chest. "Maybe I should not tell you this, Victoria, but I think Lord Melbourne is in love with you. Everyone in the house thinks, he had never behaved like this with anyone, least of all with a maid. Some pretty girls have worked here, and he has always treated them with respect and courtesy, but also with apparent indifference. But to you, he treats you with devotion. Victoria, he is courting you, with respect and prudence, but he is obviously courting you. Maybe because you're an inexperienced girl in matters of the heart you do not realize, but all those gifts, all those attentions, the way he sees you, the way he talks to you. I'm sure he feels something very special for you," said Eliza Scarrett as a mother who comforts her daughter with sweetness and affection. "Eliza, do not tell me that," Victoria said, trembling with emotion. "Why?" asked Eliza. "Because, even if it's true, Lord Melbourne cannot marry me. Do you think that a man of his position could marry a poor girl who also belongs to his servitude?" Victoria said, raising her head to see Eliza in the eyes, with a look of pain. Eliza Scarrett sketched a face of understanding and then of sadness and some compassion. "Victoria, darling, marriage is not the only way a man and a woman can have a life together," Eliza Scarrett said tenderly, stroking Victoria's face. "Eliza, I cannot become the lover of a man, not even of a man I'm in love with, as I am of Lord Melbourne. I am poor, I have no blue blood, but I have dignity. If I love a man, I want to be his wife before God and before men. I do not want to hide myself to love him and be ashamed of my relationship, and I do not want my children to be bastards," Victoria replied in anguish. "Victoria, what do you prefer? Which your children be legitimate children, but of a poor father, condemned to live in misery, or bastards, but of a rich and noble father like Lord Melbourne, who can give them a better life? Many aristocrats accept their children bastards and provide them with a good life, if they have a good heart or if they love their mothers, and I am sure Lord Melbourne would be of those men. Everyone says he was the best father for his son, and that he loved him very much. Victoria, you and me know what it's like to be born into poor families, grow in misery, and it did not help us to be born into a marriage. If you think about it, would not you like to have been the bastard daughter of a rich father who would have made your life much easier and more comfortable? Think about it, Victoria," said Miss Scarrat. "I do not know, Eliza. What you say is true, but I have always wanted to live a dignified life. I am not a prude, but in Lowood I set out to be strong and independent, and to build a life worthy with my merits. And being the lover of a rich man, even for love, would confirm the prejudices of people who despise girls like me. You are going to marry Charles, sooner or later, but I cannot dream of marrying Lord Melbourne because I am inferior to him, at least in the eyes of society. The best thing I could do is quit my job," Victoria replied. "Victoria, you're crazy. You cannot do that," Eliza said, scandalized and worried. "Quiet, Eliza. I cannot do it for now. Among other reasons because I should continue giving money to my mother for my brothers," reassured Victoria. "It seems to me well that you do not give up, Victoria. What I do not think so good is that you keep giving a large part of your salary to that wi, your mother," Eliza replied. "You know I do not do it for her, Eliza, I do it for my brothers. In any case, I have to see her tomorrow to give her the money. And as for Lord Melbourne, I'll try to make my relationship with him as professional as possible," Victoria said more calmly, but still pouting. "Until you leave the jealousy and you forgive him?" Eliza asked with a mocking smile and sly look. "Eliza, I'm not jealous," Victoria said sadly and seriously. "Maybe a little," Victoria added with a sweet, slightly mocking smile. "That's the way I like it, you smile again. You're like the little sister I never had," Eliza Scarrat said with a small laugh as she hugged Victoria with warmth and sweetness. After that conversation, when Victoria returned to see Lord Melbourne, she behaved politely but a little coldly with him, making Lord Melbourne feel a little confused and disappointed. The next day Victoria met in her free time with her mother in a tavern, and gave her the money. If Lord Melbourne had seen the woman who in the other reality was the Duchess of Kent, turned into a poor and poorly dressed woman, something vulgar, and aged, he would have been surprised. The meeting was brief and somewhat unpleasant, as all meetings between mother and daughter used to be. Victoria returned to Brocket Hall depressed, as every time she saw her ungrateful mother, not knowing that someone was watching her from the shadows. A couple of days later Victoria was surprised when the young servant Brodie told her that there was a man waiting for her in the pantry room, next to the kitchen. When Victoria arrived she had the unpleasant surprise of meeting her stepfather, the man who in the other reality answered the name of John Conroy, and who in this reality responded to the name of John Corbin, and was a man with the appearance of a street criminal. "What are you doing here?" exclaimed Victoria indignantly. "Quiet, silly girl. Cannot I visit my beloved daughter?" John replied with sarcasm and a cynical and mocking gesture on his face. "Do not call me daughter. You've never been a father to me. And you have no right to come and pester me to my place of work," Victoria said with a hint of hate on her face and red cheeks of rage. "I had to come, because you never honor our humble house with your presence," John answered in a tone of reproach. "Why, it will be. I have no desire to see you, and for that reason I cannot see my brothers as I would like," said Victoria without hiding her contempt for the man. Yet you see my wife, your mother, in a tavern to give him a misery, he said. A misery? That misery is almost half of my salary, for which I work very hard. Something you do not do, you who have the obligation to support my mother and my brothers, who for that are his wife and children, Victoria replied increasingly indignant, clenching her fists. Yes, a job very hard. I imagine that being the lover of a rich older man must be a very hard job, John replied with a lewd smile. How dare you, measly? Where do you get that infamy? Victoria said, raising the voice and waving a fist in front of its face, as if it wanted to strike it. Do not deny it, you little bitch. Several days ago I saw you by chance walking on the arm of a guy who by his appearance must be an aristocrat, and who was old enough to be your father, and both went with a little girl. And you were wearing very expensive clothes, which surely the dirty old man bought you. Said John mockingly. Do not call him that. He's a real man. A man that you are not deserving of. Clean his shoes off with your dirty tongue, Victoria said, almost screaming. Oh, how you defend your lover. I'm glad it's like this, little bitch, because it'll be easier for you to ask for more money for your parents and brothers, much more money than that misery you give your dear mother, John replied in a serious and threatening tone. Listen to me, scoundrel. I work in this house of governess of my lord's niece, he is a decent man, and I am a decent woman. Between him and me there is only one working relationship. And in no way will I allow you to question my honor, she challenged him. That you will not allow me, replied the man in a threatening tone, raising his hand as if he were going to hit her. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not that little girl you beat up every time you wanted, just like you beat my mother and you probably still does. But I'm not my mother, and I'm not frightened by a coward who only knows how to beat women, Victoria said furiously. John stepped forward and caught Victoria by the arms, while she tried to beat him in vain, but the man's brute force was imposed on the physical fragility of the short girl. You have become a beautiful creature, little Victoria. It is easy to understand why that rich dirty old man has made you his lover, you surely give him much pleasure in bed despite your face of prude. But you need a real man to teach you what pleasure is, little bitch. As your father I must educate you, John said lasciviously, and with his stinking breath of liquor and disarray he tried to kiss Victoria. Release me, damn dirty! Let go me! Let me! Help, please help me! Victoria hysterical screamed as she struggled desperately to get out of John's embrace, who continued to try to kiss her while his hands clutched Victoria's body in an obscene way. In another part of the house Lord Melbourne walked a little distracted when Connor went out to meet him. You look like a ghost. You appear suddenly and Lord Melbourne said. Go to the pantry right now. Victoria is in danger. Run. Connor said very seriously and with an intense look. Lord Melbourne saw him for a moment, then ran. When he reached the pantry, he found Victoria screaming and struggling desperately with John, who was trying to tear her dress. Lord Melbourne threw himself on him. Release her, bastard! Lord Melbourne shouted irate as he tugged on his shoulders to pull him off Victoria and punched John in the face. John fell back against the wall bleeding from the nose, and Lord Melbourne, seeing that it was John Conroy of the other reality, was bewildered for a moment, which John took advantage of to punch him, in an eye. Then John put his hands on Lord Melbourne's neck to try to strangle him, but Lord Melbourne gave headbutt him in the nose, doing the other man howl in pain. Both men began to exchange punches, and John with a brutal blow threw Lord Melbourne against the wall and tried to throw himself on him, but Lord Melbourne kicked him in the abdomen and threw him to the floor. Then Lord Melbourne threw himself upon John and tried to strangle him. I'm going to kill you! Lord Melbourne shouted, but John pushed him with the knee and they rolled down the floor, beating each other in the middle of a brutal fight. Lord Melbourne! Stop! Victoria shouted hysterically, crying desperately and waving her arms. Help, please help me, "Help Lord Melbourne!" she shouted as she ran for help. Victoria returned with Penge, Francatelli and other servants who they grabbed the two men who were determined to kill each other. With difficulty they separated the two men, both were bloodied and bruised on their faces. They could barely contain them, especially Lord Melbourne, who wanted to take revenge on what John did to Victoria. "Motherfucker!" John shouted, trying to get rid of those who held him to go over Lord Melbourne, "and all for that whore that is worthless." "Damn bastard!" cried Lord Melbourne, red with anger, trying to let go himself of those who held him to attack John. "If you say her that again, I swear you will pay with your life." Lord Melbourne raised his accusing finger. "You tried to abuse her, stinker! You filthy son of..." cried John. "You have any idea who you're talking to, you fucking bastard?" "He is Lord Melbourne, the Viscount Melbourne, former Prime Minister," he told John, "Mr. Penge, that he was one of those who grabbed him." John closed his mouth and his face reflected the indecision between the fear and the anger he still felt. Eliza Scarrett arrived at the scene of the disorder and hugged Victoria in a protective and almost maternal way, while Victoria wept in the midst of a nervous breakdown. Lord Melbourne looked at her with concern, then saw John with hatred and wish of revenge. Never before had the rooms at Brocket Hall witnessed such a scene.